Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Georgiana Kotsou, Rituals and Routines in International Chemistry Conferences in the 20th Century. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is to you.
Highly esteemed Pro-Rector, members of the Defense Committee, dear supervisors, colleagues, collaborators, friends, and family, thank you for being here with me today. In the next 15 minutes, I will present to you the research I conducted over the past years, resulting in the dissertation, Periodic Table Manners, Rituals and Routines in International Chemistry Conferences of the 20th Century. Conferences have been a prominent and regular feature of scientific life for over a century. You may be familiar with the standard image of a scientist giving a formal presentation, like the ones you see on the slide, reflecting a popular perception of conferences, that they are meetings of minds sharing knowledge. However, communicating and sharing knowledge also involves bodies and their verbal and non-verbal communication in diverse settings such as classrooms, buffets, or even lakes. All of these elements compose the experience of being a conference participant. Literature Nobel Prize winner Elias Canetti described the experience of scholarly conferences in 1935 in his book, Die Blendung. At scholastic conferences, the learned gentlemen, who for the greater part of their lives were silent, timid, and myopic mice, on these occasions, every 2 years or so, came right out of themselves. They welcomed each other, stuck the most inapposite heads together, whispered nonsense in corners, and toasted each other clumsily at the dinner table. Deeply moved and profoundly gratified, they raised aloft the banner of learning and upheld the integrity of their aims. Over and over again, in all languages, they repeated their vows. They would have kept them even without taking them. In this brief quote, Canetti highlights an understudied aspect of conferences in historical research. He discusses how the participants chat, how they feel, how they eat and drink, and how they behave as a collective. Most importantly, he highlights that conference participants enter a special state of being and behave differently from their everyday lives at universities, labs, and homes. These conference behaviors are repeated over and over again, forming traditions of socialization, which I refer to as rituals and routines. Canetti's tone towards conference rituals is sarcastic. This attitude was common among scientists and intellectuals throughout the 20th century, who found conferences to be performative, self-important, and oriented towards leisure. It is even present now in criticisms that contemporary conferences receive for being redundant, consumption-oriented, exclusive, and unsustainable. Inspired by these recurring criticisms, but also the persistent popularity of scientific conferences, my research aimed to examine the following main questions. What is the role of sociability traditions, rituals, and routines developed in scientific conferences? How do these traditions look? What kind of people, places, materials, and symbols do they mobilize? How do they matter when it comes to producing and exchanging scientific knowledge within conferences? To examine the roots and diverse forms of conference rituals, I adopted a historical approach. More specifically, I focused on the early and middle 20th century, as it is when serialized conferences became more regular and developed standard features. I selected chemistry conferences as a case study because they are both a special and representative example of scientific conferences during that period. Chemistry conferences involved both applied and basic research, and as a result brought together academics, industrialists, and government representatives, fostering mixed collaborations. In addition, the discipline of chemistry was related to the international financial, political, and military tensions of the 20th century, particularly the ones related to the 2 world wars. Throughout this process, a large number of international chemistry conferences took place, displaying a variety of conference formats. My research identified 2 prominent international conference formats: the large international congress and the small substantive conference, each of which is represented in my dissertation by a case study. The first case study is the Congress organized by the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, IUPAC. IUPAC was founded in 1999 with the goal to establish cooperation between different national chemical associations and to coordinate their scientific and technical activities. The IUPAC Congresses were representative of a conference format during the examining time, popular during the examining time, the large international congress. They took place in mostly Northern European and American cities, had a very large international participation, 2,000 to 3,500 participants, and covered a broad disciplinary scope. Their distinctive characteristic was that they were accompanied by an extensive and often luxurious social program. Scientists and their families, who also attended the congresses, participated in award-giving ceremonies, went on excursions to visit touristic and cultural landmarks, danced, enjoyed opera performances, and dined in scrumptious banquets. To analyze the social programs of large international gatherings, I used in my dissertation the case study of the 16th IUPAC Congress, taking place in Paris in 1957. During the same period, another conference format flourished, the Small Substantive Conference. Unlike the large international congresses, small substantive conferences were, as their name betrays, small, because they had a very selective process of inviting and accepting participants. They operated on the principle that small groups of brilliant scientists could produce and exchange cutting-edge knowledge and innovative ideas. The Gordon Research Conferences, first launched in the 30s and continuing until today, are still a very popular example of small substantive conferences in the field of chemistry. What made the GRC special regarding the socialization tradition during the examining period was that they had established a brand image in opposition to their contemporary large conferences. Instead of university buildings and hotels in capital cities, they took place in remote private high schools in the countryside of New Hampshire, where scientists were able to dress informally instead of wearing suits, to spend time doing sports instead of touristic activities, and to discuss unpublished ideas in a heated manner instead of giving formal, polite presentations. I analyzed sources on the GRCs to discuss how they associated the informality between the scientists with ideas about how knowledge can and should be more efficiently produced. Studying interaction in the past without having the privilege to observe conference interactions can be tricky. To counterbalance this lack of observation, I performed archival research involving both institutional and personal collections. I engaged with a diverse pool of sources, such as proceedings of meetings between conference organizers, evaluation forms filled in by the participants, hotel advertisements, food menus, and floor plans to reconstruct the locations, materiality, and consumption of social programs. Oral history interviews of conference attendees and organizers, and personal correspondence proved to be particularly useful to understand the experiences, performances, and self-presentation choices of scientists. An entire chapter of my dissertation was devoted to the visual analysis of conference photographs. Photographs portray rituals, ceremonies, and interactions of conferences. At the same time, taking group photographs is a conference tradition itself and deserves to be analyzed on its own merits. After presenting to you the case studies and sources I used for my research, I would like to return to my main research question and discuss some of my key findings. What is the role of rituals and routines inside scientific conferences? Rituals and routines participated in making scientists feel immersed and integrated in conference settings and activities. The main way in which rituals created immersion entailed a contradiction. They made their participants feel vulnerable and outside their comfort zone, and at the same time made them feel comfortable and secure in their interactions with their peers. Vulnerability was achieved by forcing scientists to travel to faraway locations and spend there a significant amount of time. In this way, scientists were separated from the habits, spaces, and relationships of their everyday lives. They entered a new state of being, the one of the conferences, which had its own rules and objectives that the scientists had to adhere to. One characteristic example is the remote private high schools where the Gordon conferences took place. There, the scientists were required to sleep in bunk beds, wake up by the school alarm, share their meals in the school canteen, and spend the entire of their days discussing science without any external distractions. In addition, the organization encouraged them to dress informally and engage with their peers competitively without taking too much into account each other's professional prestige and affiliations, in order to break the habitual formalities of their workplaces. Another example of rituals creating vulnerability is the extravagant ceremonies and touristic activities that the IUPAC Congresses organized. These activities relied on spectacle, aesthetics, and exclusivity that were far from the participants' everyday lives and familiar environments. On the slide, you can get an impression of these events, a Congress banquet taking place in the Palace of Versailles. In order to dine in the palace, taste this gigantic cake, and be served by waiters dressed up in 18th century uniforms and wigs, the participants had to adhere to a formal dress code and blend in with their luxurious surroundings. However, to secure the scientists' immersion, conferences complemented this sense of vulnerability with a sense of familiarity by mobilizing spaces, materials, and symbols from their everyday lives. A prominent example here was the fact that most conferences, especially the largest ones, included the families of the scientists, particularly their wives, in the social activities. The wives' presence at the conference allowed them to assist their husbands in practical tasks, but also to socialize with one another and participate in the creation of social bonds between the scientists' families, lasting even after the conferences. While women were celebrated as social actors inside conferences, during the same period, the very small numbers of participating female scientists were not acknowledged by the conference organization. Familiarity was also established during formal ceremonies, such as awards and keynote lectures, which were always given by renowned scientists, often Nobelists, celebrating and reminding the participants of familiar professional hierarchies. Finally, leisure activities, such as museum visits and opera nights or touristic excursions, assumed a shared class identity between the participants, based on their ability to appreciate art and engage in bourgeois leisure practices similar to the ones that they did in their holidays. But why was establishing ritual immersion so important for scientific conferences? The answer becomes clear if we look at the three predominant functions of conference rituals and routines. Rituals participated in scientific community building. They expressed and reproduced the standards defining who belonged and who didn't belong in scientific communities. By doing so, they set barriers in participation related to gender roles and a gender distribution of labor in science, with women being celebrated in the social rather than the scientific realm, reproducing professional and social hierarchies in the field of chemistry, favoring famous scientists, and projecting a homogeneous bourgeois class scientific identity to the participants through consumption and leisure. Rituals participated in knowledge exchange within conferences. More specifically, conference organizers and participants consciously created ideas about how social interaction is related to knowledge production and engineered conference formats based on those ideas. Such was the example of the Gordon conferences, promoting informality and the vulnerability associated with it as an ideal mode of communication in their conferences. Rituals were involved in the commercial dimension of conferences. Conferences received sponsorships by companies or the hosting states to pay for their social activities, like the cocktail party sponsored by Kellogg that you can see on the slide. The role of these sponsorships sometimes shaped conference activities and their intended purposes, for example, by directing them towards involving more industrial actors, or by promoting the national prestige of the hosting nations, or by manifesting international relations. Looking at the rituals and routines of early 20th century international scientific conferences gave some clear insights into the functions of conference sociability. Those insights generate questions relevant for contemporary conference organization. How is it possible to secure immersion in online conferences? How can leisure in scientific conferences be less consumption-oriented? Who works at conferences? Do gender roles and professional hierarchies still play a part in the labor distribution? Answering these questions allows us to imagine better, more inclusive, and sustainable scientific communication practices. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I now would like to open the floor for, I would like to open the opposition and would like to give the floor to Professor Raf de Bond, who has a chair in History of Science and the Environment and who has also been the chair of the Assessment Committee. The floor is to you.
Thanks a lot. Dear candidate, dear Georgiana, let me start by congratulating you for your work. I think that periodic table manners, because that's the title of the PhD, really offers a very fascinating window on the changing conference culture in the 20th century. And I also think you really managed to combine a historical interest also with anthropological and more sociological sensitivities you clearly have. I also think it's a very theoretically well-informed book and engagingly written. And as you also hinted at the end of your presentation, I also think it's not only of relevance for historians, but also for the present-day rethinking of conference culture. And this is often discussed maybe in more technical terms, but hardly ever with regard to the rituals that are so prominent in your book or in your PhD. Now, of course, my role in the rituals and routines of today is not just to praise your work, but also to ask some maybe more critical questions. The question that I have is a double question. It has to do with chronology and change over time. And the first part really has to do with the focus of the PhD as a whole, so the period 1940 to 1980. And my question really is, do you, maybe first of all, why this period? Do you consider this period as a transformative period, a period of important change, as compared to other periods when we put this in a slightly longer time perspective? So that's the first part. And the second part also has to do with chronology, and then particularly with regard to the Gordon Research Conferences, because there you discuss them for the entire period, right, 1940, 1980, more or less. And so there my question would be, do you see change within the time period, right? So, of course, 1940 is a rather different moment than 1980. So has anything changed over this time period? So 2 questions about chronology, basically why 1940, 1980, and then secondly, what changed within this period?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your question. So to address the first part of your question regarding the general chronological focus of the dissertation, why I selected this specific period from beginning to end, it is because it offered a more serialized and standardized view of the conferences taking place during said period. As in conferences, well, the IUPAC congresses, I must say, were still discovering themselves in the beginning of the century, as IUPAC was founded in 1999, as I mentioned in my presentation. But by 1957, when my case study takes place, the social program seemed to be relatively standardized in the sense that the organizers of the IUPAC congresses were resulting and using standard procedures that they had inherited from previous conference organizers. And proof in a sense that congresses were so standardized by that time is also the fact that, for instance, for the IUPAC Paris Congress in 1957, the organizer received a variety of leaflets from hotels, from places hosting banquets and different events, suggesting them specific packages, which means that these very providers of those services were familiar with a congress organization, and especially in Paris, a big European city hosting a lot of congresses, and they themselves reproduced and directed the future congress organizers into performing again the same procedures. On the second part of your question, focusing specifically on the Gordon Research Conferences, as you said, I tried to cover the whole period, and the method I used in my chapter and the approach was more of a snapshot approach rather than following chronological change over time. I did that because my focus was not so much to explore what changed in the dynamics, but what remained stable in how the conference organizers form this brand image of conferences. And this brand image, and one of its strengths, was that they were innovative in the beginning, but then that they were also standard and standardized, so that they maintained their basic characteristics over time. But of course, times did change, so the Gordon conferences didn't remain exactly the same. From the point of rituals and routines, at some point, the Gordon conferences, I think that was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, opened up to new locations as well, so outside the US even. And to maintain the brand image of the conferences, they also sought for places that were able to reproduce the same effect that the New Hampshire colleges had on the conference communication and informality and being removed from places of stimulation, in a sense. Another point of change was, of course, the consistency of the participants. It became more racially and gender diverse. This is something that I didn't look into very intensely, but since I looked at photographs from the conferences, it is very visually present. And another small thing that I noticed, and I think is related to the point of gender and gender distribution, is that when the conference organizers of the Gordon conferences registered the numbers of the participants, they also registered the numbers of wives attending. So that category, after some point, stopped being called wives and started being called like family or partners or extra or guests. So this is, again, maybe a small point of change on how the organizers also perceived their respective audiences.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Brigitte van Tichelen, who is Director of International Affairs and a resident scholar at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia and Paris. The floor is to you.
Thank you. So first of all, Georgiana, it's a real pleasure to be here at this point, this ritual point in your academic journey. From the few years we have known each other, I've witnessed your growth, your intellectual growth, but also you taking your place in this curious tribe, the scientific community, that you are also examining and analyzing, and this is, of course, at the core of your PhD. The pandemic was very disruptive for you, as it has been for many others, but in your case, you were able to take the challenge. Of course, the object, the very focus of your research, the conference, was also something the whole community was reflecting on. And you took the opportunity to have this self-reflection and to mirror that in your research, also offering ways of thinking for the future, which is not often the case in a history of science thesis. What also was, to me, really interesting, because there's a couple of new tools that I thought, oh, I'm going to go back to the material now with a new look and new questions, was the use of photography. We use usually photography just to illustrate. And here it becomes a tool in itself, an insight in the conference and in the scientific activities. And my question now kind of continues on what Professor de Bond just said, though it focuses more on space and how space promotes, supports power structures. You clearly make the point for the Gordon Research Conferences, and also how it singles out a specific type of scientific personae. In the chapter for the Gordon Conference, you divide the group in 3 types of scientists: the academic scientist, the industrial scientist, the governance scientist, following, of course, what the sources are giving you as a lead. And of course, the academic setting suits one of them more than the others. So that would be my first question, how the others took their marks in this space that was more appropriate to some than to others. The other question also related to space, and how does that play out with the IUPAC congresses, since those are different spaces, and leading to the future, since that is one of the aspects of your thesis, how would you evaluate conferences in convention and big conference centers, and how that affect the power structures at play?
Esteemed opponent, I'm also very glad to have you here today, and thank you very much for your kind words and for your question. To answer the first part of your question regarding how space affects power structures, and specifically how industrial or governmental actors or even other actors adjusted and responded to the spatial organizations that were maybe not the ones that they were familiar with. Looking at the example of the Gordon Research Conferences, I would not say that space necessarily played an exclusionary role with regards to industrialists or governmental scientists, in the sense that, of course, they were also specifically invited to the conferences, and they also had the ability to get there, as well as the scientists, financially, because the participation at the Gordon conferences, especially in the early days, was self-funded. So it automatically required some capital to get there, which maybe industrial scientists could afford even more easily than early career academic scientists. When it comes to the informality of communication, that was also part of the effects that space generated in the Gordon conferences by inviting scientists to engage informally in the coffee bar or during eating or during doing sports. I would say that in general, the impression that I got from the sources was that the academic scientists considered, so this is from the point of view of the academic scientists, the industrial scientists as not being very responsive to that informality and free expression and exchange, in the sense that they mostly asked questions rather than giving informal input like their academic peers, and that was attributed to the industrialist perhaps potential desire to preserve, on one hand, corporate secrets, but also to benefit from knowledge without offering back to it. So this is something that I would be able to say, but it doesn't, of course, answer directly your question when it comes to space, but more the informality that was part of the spatial organization of the Gordon Research Conferences. When it comes to the IUPAC congresses, again, of course, traveling, and also cross-Atlantic traveling for some scientists, because in the Gordon conferences, a lot of the scientists were already American, so, and you didn't have this huge participations that the IUPAC congresses gathered, but not only the rotating locations of the IUPAC congresses, but also the long distances that some scientists were required to cover. I would say, is an element of space that excluded automatically scientists who weren't able to travel long distances, both because of personal finances, but also perhaps condition. Space, in a sense, also involved the languages that were spoken in conferences. So that is also something to take into account, because IUPAC congresses, while they had an official language depending on the hosting country and international balances of each time period, but they tried to secure more inclusivity, in a sense, even though they wouldn't use that term, in participation, by having translation systems during the conferences in the space, either with live translators or with headphones that people would wear, scientists would wear, in order to receive the translated presentations of their peers. And in that sense, space tried to flatten out the power structures of the scientists who would speak French, for instance, if the official language of the Congress was French, and to also include scientists who spoke Italian or English or German. But also, this is the extent of that inclusivity, in the sense that only a few languages were available for translation. When it comes to space and contemporary conferences, of course, the point on traveling and exclusion based on the financial and personal conditions of the traveling scientists still applies. And this is something that has been criticized a lot, especially when large scientific conferences take place in cities like Amsterdam, where hotels cost minimum 150 euros per night. At the same time, there have been efforts to compensate that by moving online, and this mobilizes a variety of different spaces, not just one room where scientists are gathered and the hotels or restaurants where they eat. That space, the online one, the digital one, also entails its own power dynamics and exclusions, because it's based on a digital infrastructure that may not be available to everyone, or that not everyone can use with the same skill and will, depending on different factors. But it also creates this dynamic of people having to do multiple things at the same time. So when you're attending an online conference, you are in your home, so this is the space that you're in, or at your office, and you have to squeeze in the sessions and the presentation between taking care of your children or parents, between cooking lunch, between giving a little lecture that you promised to a colleague, answering emails, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, space reproduces a hierarchy that potentially also exists even without the online environment, but it becomes more heightened, in a sense, in the online environment, of people who have a lot of duties piling up, or a lot of professional pressure put on them to balance different tasks, and people who have less of it. But I would say that maybe everyone has a lot of different tasks to balance out. I hope this answers your question, at least to some extent.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Sven Wittmalm. Professor Wittmalm has a chair in History of Science and Ideas at the Department for History and Science and Ideas at Uppsala University. Professor Wittmalm, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Georgiana. I think the work that I've followed to such extent has resulted in a very interesting and pioneering analysis of scientific conferences that have usually in the history of science been taken for granted. And you have shown that they shouldn't be, and you've done it from a cultural perspective, which is also unusual. I think it's well written and theoretically well informed, and one great advantage is that you don't only cover a lot of ground theoretically and empirically, but also you cover two very different kinds of conferences, which are sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum, because there are other kinds of conferences as well. But the large ones and the small, very focused ones, and elitist ones. And you bring home the message that the scientific conference is a rather heterogeneous phenomenon that needs to be understood from a variety of historical angles, which your thesis does. I have a question about what you have talked a bit about already, inclusivity, exclusivity, inspired by your propositions 6 and 8 in the proposition part of the thesis. This is a new thing to me. We don't usually, in Sweden, where I come from, have propositions, but I think this is really interesting. Anyhow, you say that interactions in the past are best studied by looking at both presence and absence, and academia reproduces class. These are issues having to do with inclusion and exclusion, as I understand them, and I agree with both propositions. They are obviously connected. The reproduction of class, or for that matter, gender, or ethnicity, is about mechanisms that determine inclusion and exclusion. But I'd ask you to comment on what such an approach tells us that we don't already know, being the devil's advocate to some extent here. It may seem like conferences mirror much of what happens in society in general. What you find in your conference material is things that we recognize as rather typical of the period that you study. And for instance, the fact that there are to take a very obvious example, the fact that there are few or no female participants in conferences, chemical conferences, has to do with the fact that there were very few academically educated female chemists. That's an obvious example. But my question would be if you can give an example or two where you show that this approach of yours produce new or unexpected knowledge about either science or conferences.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your question. If I understand correctly, and you can correct me, you're asking whether conferences can produce knowledge with regards to difference, power dynamics, and balances within professional culture, or unexpected knowledge in general.
Yes. Is there anything about science and scientists' conferences that's sort of specific to that group, or something that's perhaps unusual or that affects science in a way that you didn't necessarily expect?
So conferences are, and the rituals and routines specifically that I'm focusing on, they do entail this aspect of not only reproducing collective representations of a professional culture, but also potentially subverting them in some respects. And this is also relevant to the example that I mentioned about the Gordon Research Conferences and informality, which was meant to some extent, not only reproduce the professional hierarchies that the scientists came with in the conferences, but also to transform some of the scientists' positions professionally, in the sense that you would have early career scientists with the opportunity to engage informally with their more higher academic, not peers, but colleagues, and then later potentially find a position in a specific university or research project because of that slight subversion in the norms of informality. Now this, in a sense, is not particularly unexpected, because networking is part of academic professional culture. So overall, I would say that academic conferences are, in the end, a rather conservative institution when it comes to reproducing and mirroring professional culture rather than transforming it, and that the transformative effects and the anti-structure that I mentioned also in my dissertation of rituals is only used to again reinforce and reproduce professional hierarchies. Now, this applies, of course, to the material that I have studied for my historical research. On contemporary scientific conferences, there are definitely efforts or performative efforts of subverting said professional hierarchies and power structures and making the conferences more inclusive by inviting more participants. But in the end, these transformative movements do not entail a more fundamental redistribution of academic, financial, social, and cultural capital that would be necessary for conferences to produce new knowledge and new power structures, and not just reproduce the professional ones. So this is more related perhaps to my propositions rather than my research.
Are you satisfied with the answer? Yes. Okay. Then we will continue the opposition with Dr. Simone Schleper. Dr. Schleper is assistant professor in global history of science, technology, and the environment. The floor is to you.
Dear candidate, dear Georgiana, let me start by congratulating you on the completion of this PhD and the writing of your thesis. I join the other members of the Corona in complimenting complimenting you on its readability and the to-the-pointness, also of the proposition. And you definitely have a way with titles. I had to chuckle a few times while reading your manuscript. So while reading your thesis, I often really felt immersed in the conference or the conferences you are describing. And what you described also definitely reminded me of other conferences that I came across in my own work. But these conferences that I work on, they don't deal with chemistry, right? And my first question actually relates to this. So in your introduction and in other places of your thesis, you refer to Margaret Mead's The Small Conference from 1968. What Mead describes fits perhaps best to the Gordon Research Conferences and the small setting of those, although some aspects of what she is describing might also apply to other larger settings, especially the intellectual highlights and the aesthetic revelations that she talks about. Yet the conferences that Mead discusses, they are not chemical conferences. They might actually not even be scientific conferences in the first place. Rather, she writes that her writing had been influenced by the Delos meetings, so a small eclectic group of scientists and planners with different backgrounds concerned with questions about human settlements, acoustics, as that was called. She also says to have been influenced by larger meetings, such as the World Council of Churches or the World Conference on Church and Society from the late 60s, and other meetings by post-war international organizations, such as UNESCO. So when studying conferences as a social activity, as you do, does it matter what type of conference you study? What have you learned that is specific or special about scientific or chemical conferences? And when we study scientific conferences as a social activity, do we learn something about the science that is being discussed there, so the content of the science?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your very interesting question. So as you correctly pointed it out, I reference a few times the book by Margaret Mead, especially in relation to the Gordon Research Conferences. And indeed, the conferences that Mead draws from are mostly anthropological meetings, but also other meetings that you just mentioned now. Now, I think the point of connection between Mead's The Small Conference and the Gordon Research Conferences is not so much, not only the format of the conferences and definitely not the content of the conferences, but rather the idea that in chemistry conferences of that period, as exemplified by the Gordon Research Conferences, there was a conscious effort from scientists, rather than, for example, anthropologists like Margaret Mead, to critically examine their own conference formats, make observations and associations between how conference formats operated and how knowledge is best produced, and then apply those and reproduce them in that way. So in that sense, this is also something that made chemistry conferences special, at least in the case study that I followed, that there was a conscious effort from scientists on how scientific knowledge is best produced anthropologically. Of course, this effort, in the case of the Gordon Research Conferences, was also influenced, and I think I also briefly mentioned that in the Gordon Conferences chapter, by ideas of management ideas of how meetings between industrialists have to take place in order to best produce scientific knowledge. So this is also something that is perhaps special to the field of chemistry, reproducing these closed meetings between industrialists and their formats in the context of the Gordon Research Conferences to see how knowledge can be best produced. On whether studying rituals and routines of conferences can also say something about the content of the science produced, this is something that I didn't really explore in my own research. And I think it would be very interesting to look more into, to see how exactly the discussions went. But I must say, at least from my own research experience on these specific case studies, it was very difficult to find what kind of knowledge was produced and reproduced within the informal interactions, especially because they were informal. And in the case of the Gordon Research Conferences, it was also not allowed for at least a long period of time to record things from the sessions and to reproduce what was being said within the conferences outside. So that makes it even harder to examine exactly how did this informal communication participate in knowledge production within the context of the conferences. It would have to be done from an outside of the conference perspective by mapping networks of scientists and looking at their publications before, after the conferences and their scientific collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Annick Hommels, who has a chair in Socio-Historical Technology Studies at the Department of Society Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidates, dear Georgiana, I would also like to congratulate you on your dissertation. I found your focus on the routines and rituals at chemistry conferences very original. And I also thought that your sources gave a very rich insight into these practices of conference participants, not only the scientists, but also their spouses and the staff supporting them. And the thesis not only looked at the activities taking place at the conferences itself, but also in these off-session activities, such as sports, leisure, and cultural activities. It made me also think a lot about the conferences that I attended over the years, and the kind of love-hate relationship I have with them. My question is about the path dependency of conferences. You mentioned that term, and you touched on this issue a number of times in your thesis, especially at the beginning and at the end. You mentioned that scientific conferences and the ways in which they have been practiced in the 20th century, not only in the field of chemistry, have many downsides. You also repeated some of those here today. Climate concerns related to the flights needed to bring all these scientists together in one place, the commercialization of conferences, their elite character, the focus on consumption, inequalities related to the choice of location, access to conferences, etc. And during the COVID crisis, we have experienced that conferences can be practiced in different ways, like the online formats. Nevertheless, at this moment, I believe that we have almost come back to the situation before COVID, where most conferences take place on site again. So my question is actually what your dissertation can tell us about the path dependence of conferences. And I'm particularly interested in this notion of path dependence because it allows us to link the past that you studied with the future. So let us start with the past. Having studied these conference practices in the field of chemistry in the 20th century, you have an idea of how this path dependency came about, how it was shaped over time. And based on your insights, which aspects of conferences do you think are harder to change and which a little bit easier? And towards the future, which actors or institutions can play a role in shaping new pathways for conferences? Also considering the questions, which aspects should we preserve? What is worth preserving of conference practices of the past? So those are questions, one about the past and one about the future, but also I'm interested in the role of crises in overcoming path dependency. So you mentioned the COVID crisis. What can be the role of crises in opening up new directions for scientific conferences and how they are practiced? Can you respond to those questions, please?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. I find them very interesting. I would like to refer back briefly to one of my propositions where I quote Ludwig Wittgenstein saying that if fleas had rights, they would be based on dogs. And I think this is particularly relevant for academic conferences and their aspects that cause this path dependence and reproduction of structures, power or not. The dog in this case is academic professional culture, and this is where conferences draw the most of. And this is also why I, as I mentioned before, find conferences to be a slightly conservative institution and resistant to change. I think one starting point of imagining new future practices would be to imagine different kinds of actors that would be able to participate in said academic professional cultures and then also conferences. So rather than only focusing, of course, on the spaces or the food or the leisure, which are things that I know more about because I studied them, but of course there are other aspects more related to the contents and disciplines of conferences that also play a part in who attends them. I think, yes, that it would be important to think about different actors attending conferences and different actors becoming also scientists and academics who attend conferences. Another way of dealing with that would be to be inspired by different professional cultures that are perhaps themselves not necessarily more inclusive, but have different ways of communicating that can appeal to different people. So, for example, having more mixed conferences that rely more on involving artistic practices in the communication of scientific knowledge. I think this is something that has been experimented on, but maybe didn't take, again, because the professional culture is not necessarily as open to these things. And on the role of crisis in overcoming path dependence, well, we did have a big crisis, you mentioned it, it was COVID, and there was a big material transformation in how conferences were meant to take place. But because this crisis was to an extent, or to the extent that relates to conferences, overcome. We quickly returned and fell back on the practices that took place before COVID. So maybe the crisis would need to be a bit more fundamental, and again, affecting professional culture rather than only the materiality and infrastructures that academic conferences are based on. I hope that answers your question to an extent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We may still have time for one final question, and I would like to pass the floor to Dr. van Tichelen for a final question.
Thank you. Since I have the final question, I will go on the subversive side. So it's very clear in your PhD, in your presentation, in the way you answer, that you see conference as a way of reproducing certain features of the scientific community, powers and so on, exclusiveness. But then rituals are precisely the mean of maintaining things and reproducing things. So my question is, how can change occur and where to look for? Is there subversive rituals that can appear? Have you traced some changes in ritual that would signal a more profound change in the culture? Or are there other means?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Perhaps the change in academic conferences or affecting academic conferences can also come from the outside. And what I'm thinking is this notion of counter conferences or alternative ways of meeting and gathering and producing and negotiating knowledge that can also relate not so much to scientists or involve scientists, but rather artists or even political collectives who have their own forms of deliberation, expression, and also attempts to foster change. So perhaps scientific conferences could be inspired by other ways of meetings and gatherings taking place in different places. It can also be related to a difference in allocating resources for scientific conferences.
So you can finish your sentence.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I I lost it.
Good. Georgiana Kotsou, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. The mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Georgiana Kotsou. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Thompson is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. The floor is to you. Please rise.
Dear Dr. Kotsou, Georgiana, do you promise to work in accordance with the principle of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Georgiana Kotsou, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Georgiana, Dr. Kotsou, first of all, my warmest congratulations. Although I don't think anybody, but perhaps you, ever doubted that you would arrive here. I know the path hasn't always been easy, but it only gives us all the more reasons to celebrate this very moment. Writing a dissertation is never easy for anybody, even if your supervisors see no problems whatsoever. But in your case, the uneasiness had an extra dimension, I think, because it was always mixed with feelings of doubt about academia. Do I want to be here? Is this my world? Such mixed feelings arose already during the application process, I remember, when a week or so before the deadline you wrote to me, and I quote, "I am not a suitable applicant," after which you announced that you would pull out of the whole thing. I thought differently. And fortunately, I managed to persuade you soon to think differently as well, and you continued the process, and we could hire you. And so you embarked on the project. But the beginnings were rough, as you had to rush to finish your MA thesis first, then finish another MA degree, and then plunge right into a PhD project without any breaks. Then within a few months, you had to write a project plan, teach courses for the first time, and run off to a big archive tour in the United States. And then that tour was cut short as Corona broke out, and you barely escaped through a closing US border. Fortunately you did, and you arrived safely again in Europe, landing in Maastricht, but then finding yourself in a long-lasting lockdown. Also not easy, and a big contrast to the initial situation. And so initially, I think academia has not been a very good hostess to you, except perhaps during the meetings we had with the wider European project that you were part of course, the HERA SciConf project that Sven Wiedmalm and several others were on. We had these meetings in Paris already, I remember, in early 2020, just before Corona. Online meetings, of course, and then after Corona in Leiden, late fall of 21, in London and several other places. These, it was very evident, you enjoyed a lot. I think because of the other scholars, like Thomas and Laura, because the meetings were very intellectually stimulating, and because, of course, they also were a lot of fun. They were a little bit like scientific conferences, one might say. And it was at such meetings that I could see you grow into your role, impress the audiences with subsequent chapters, and quickly become an academic despite yourself. One aspect that seemed to help in all of this was the traveling. Of course, as we've all heard today, our entire project and your project was about academic travels and about academic sociability. But now I found out that you did not only study these aspects, but you practice them too. Because I can announce to everybody here, Georgiana is a big traveler. Besides the project meetings, you also went during this whole period to, and I look back at our correspondence, to New York, to Berlin, to Budapest, Copenhagen, Vilnius, and many other places, and also several longer stays. In Philadelphia multiple times, in Uppsala, in Sven Wittmann's department, to his great hospitality, in Lisbon for a while, and of course in Greece several times, staying with friends and family, and sometimes also working there. Plus, not only did you travel there for work, you would also always make connections with the people there. As I learned during our cooperation, Georgiana has friends and makes friends everywhere. She knows people everywhere. It's astonishing. Needs no introductions from my side to anybody. But the interesting thing is you have and make those friends both inside and outside of academia, meeting also people in the city of Philadelphia and all these different places where you travel. So this trait again, I think, reflects your ambiguous relationship with the academic world that you study, are part of, and are not part of. I guess I learned to accept that ambiguity. And I've actually come to see that you have a point in your half-heartedness there, of your lukewarm feelings. It's not that you complain a lot about academic life. That, in fact, would make you more of an academic, because it's not uncommon for my colleagues and maybe myself to complain constantly, no matter how comfortable their positions are. Nor do you eschew the work. Georgiana is actually a very hard worker and quite a perfectionist writer whose texts, and it has been commemorated today, are always a joy to read. It's more, I think, that you don't like academic pretense and maybe also fake engagement, and you don't like the competitive rat race that seems to characterize the neoliberal university. Such views, I've come to believe and be convinced, are very legitimate. But what is more, I think such views would actually make you more suitable for academia, as I've said so many times, but let me now stop pushing that point because I've done it so often. Instead, let me say that I have found it an immense pleasure to work with you over the past years, and that wherever you choose to go next, I'm sure you'll have a bright future ahead of you. In between that past and the future is the present, and hence for now, congratulations and celebrations.
Dear Dr. Kotsou, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you with this new degree. Let's now go to the rector and have a toast on the young doctor. And can I ask the members of the assessment committee to first follow me to the stairs together with Georgiana Kotsou to take a picture, and can I also ask the parents to join us for the picture? Thank you.